Good morning and welcome. It's just after 11:15 and welcome to today's session around diversity and inclusion in museums. My name's Tamsin Russell and I work for the Museums Association. I'm a cis 50-year-old woman with a blunt fringe and coral lipstick and dark black glasses. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, to be chairing this session and to be sharing this space with some really esteemed and excellent panelists. In terms of what we're going to be going through today, the format will be, we'll hear from each of them in terms of a little bit of their background and their particular lens or area of practice that they're interested in. And then we've prepared some questions that we hope will answer some questions from wherever you're sitting across the globe, in Scotland, London, or wherever, to enable you to look at your practice with a more inclusive lens to realise whatever your objectives and your organisation's objectives are around diversifying and including audiences and workforce. And that's a really important point. We're looking at diversity and inclusion from both perspectives today. After the questions from my perspective, we really want you to be utilising this resource. So feel free all the way through to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. If you want to ask a question sort of generically to all of the panelists, that's absolutely fine. But if there's a particular nugget that you would like one of our panelists to answer, then please just highlight that by mentioning their name first in the question, and then I will be able to field that when we get to that stage. In terms of why I'm delighted to be here and what I'll be handing over very shortly, in my role at the Museums Association, my focus is around inclusion, equality and diversity. And having worked both on programmes that have supported that, for example, our Mentoring for All programme, I'm also now in the stage of mainstreaming all of that good practice. And I think there may be people in the audience that perhaps have worked on project-related diversity programmes. And actually the biggest challenge is when you move on from that project phase is to make it business as usual. So I'm hoping, again, there'll be some really interesting insights from either everybody around this space, or equally, feel free to use the chat function and share your own experience, your own suggestions. If we're all learning together, we can all make change together. And on that note, I'm now going to hand over to each of our panelists in sequence, just to hear from them, their role. And so first of all, it gives me great delight to hand over to Esther. So over to you, Esther.
Thanks so much, Tamsin. Just to give you a bit of audio description for my visual appearance, I'm female, white, in my mid-40s with kind of shoulder-length grey silvery hair, and I'm wearing a black top. So to give you a bit of background about what my work entails, I'm the head of the Accentuate programme, and Accentuate is a specialist programme that works within the cultural development agency Screen South. And we've been set up for about 13 years. Originally, we were set up in the lead up to the Paralympic Games. So we were specifically kind of delivering cultural activity around the Paralympic Games, and that was across the cultural sector. So with sports, heritage, arts, tourism, and really to kind of make an impact for disabled people to start to kind of really influence the cultural sector. And that kind of work was really successful. So we then decided to really focus our energy specifically on heritage and arts projects. And again, specialising in giving opportunities for deaf, disabled and neurodivergent people to participate, but also to lead. And that is a really important part of our work. So we delivered a big heritage project called History of Place that finished about 3 years ago. And that looked at 800 years of disability heritage across 8 built heritage sites. And we worked with over 100 volunteers to really start uncovering some of the hidden histories that related to those heritage sites. And also we worked with 3 museums. So we worked with Museum of Liverpool, Shed in Bristol and the V&A. And really that relationship with those museums was the culmination of the project and uncovering that research and then co-curating 3 exhibitions. But during that period, we realised it was really difficult to tell authentic disability history stories without disabled people in curatorial roles. So that then sparked the idea for our next project, which is what launched in about November this year. Well, last year, sorry, not this year, November, seems like this year to me. And and that's called Curating for Change. And that's a series of work placement programs for deaf, disabled and neurodivergent people that want to start a career in curating. So we're working with over 20 museums across England to deliver 8 fellowships. The fellowships are 18 months long, and that really gives the curator a chance to kind of get their teeth stuck into a project and have quite a significant output at the end of it. And then we're also delivering 8 shorter traineeship placements. So that's really for people that just kind of want to start finding out about what a curatorial career might be. So I think that kind of gives you a flavour of what we're doing and where I'm at today. And although we work more broadly than just museums, today my focus will be talking about museums and inclusion. Thank you.
Thanks, Esther, and lovely to hear from you. Over to you, Freya.
Thanks, Tamsin. Hi, everyone. So my name's Freya. It's a real pleasure to be here today, so thank you for having me. So as digital curator at the Highlands Museum, that's based in Fort George up in Inverness, a large part of my role involves developing community projects and resources to challenge colonial narratives in our museum space. I recently pioneered the Community Curators programme at the museum, which is an ongoing project that works with different community volunteers to ensure that our museum is representative of our community, be it local, national and international. Overall, the project aims to ensure that everybody feels heard and represented in the museum. So just to give you a little bit of background about what the project was, so we've had 1 instalment so far and we have more planned. We've produced a 6-week course of workshops and lectures for a group of community curators across the country, resulting in new alternative object labels for objects that are on display in the museum relating to the Indian Rebellion, or the First War of Indian Independence, which is how the group chose to refer to the conflict. We've got more programmes planned for the year, including a collaborative project with another Highland Regimental Museum. I also work with Museums and Heritage Highland in a freelance capacity as the creative co-lead to develop the Digital Museum of the Highlands, which is a really exciting project. This immersive digital museum will be searchable by themes, and I'm advocating to ensure that Highland collections can be viewed in their colonial contexts and don't shy away from exploring and discussing the roots of empire and historic slavery that are so prevalent in Scotland and Highland collections. So I think that in order for museums to be truly inclusive spaces, decolonization has to become a priority. There are so many people who feel unwelcome in the museum space because of outdated colonial narratives and inherently racist structures. Museums have a responsibility to share and openly address the colonial legacies of their collections, whilst championing co-curation and priority community input to break down structures of gatekeeping, which can just ensure that everybody feels safe and represented in the museum space. Museums should be inherently woke spaces, implementing anti-racism to actively break down racist and colonial structures that are entwined in the fabric of British museums. So that's me, and that's what I do. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Freya. I really love that idea of safe and active in terms of language. Some really lovely language here. Over to you, Michelle, to hear from you.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Michelle Mcgraw. I'm a white woman in my late 30s, and I have long salt and pepper hair, and I'm wearing silver hoop earrings. I've worked in museums for about 15 years, and I'm a learning and engagement specialist. I'm currently head of learning at Beaux Arts in East London. And I also founded the Museum as Muck network in 2018. This network is for working class people in museums and galleries, and we have a registered membership of over 500 people who we affectionately refer to as muckers. And I also work alongside a steering group from the network to affect change in museums with regard to class inclusion. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. And over to you, Tom.
Hi, I'm Tamsin Dunn, and I'm an independent consultant, facilitator and coach. I specialise in organisational development around inclusion, diversity and equity. And I've was previous chair of Museum Detox, which is a network for Black, Asian and ethnically diverse museums, heritage and gallery workers. And it's a network and a community of belonging of people of colour who want to see change in the cultural and museum sector, to see equity and representation and better inclusion of people of colour. So progressing people in the workforce to more leadership and decision-making roles, programming in terms of more diverse stories being told, more better representation, decolonization, which was mentioned before in terms of a core subject of what the network champions. And actually it's a space to share experiences, find joy, solidarity, fun and safe spaces to discuss systemic racial inequality in the sector. So that's been sort of my involvement in terms of working with Museum Detox as a network and change in the sector.
Thank you so much. So just a reminder, just if you've got any questions that you want to ask, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We will be coming to your questions after a series of questions I'm now going to ask the rest of the panel. But thank you very much for contextualising your interest, your experience, and also your ambition, guys. So I've got a few questions that I'm going to ask. And the first person I'm going to ask, and then I'll go through everybody else in terms of your feedback, is I'm going to ask Esther this question, then I'll come to you, Tan, then Michelle, and then Freya. So from a practical perspective, for your particular lens around inclusion, what do you think the most critical issues are for the sector, Esther?
Well, I've kind of hinted at it already, I think, but I think representation is an absolutely critical issue. In terms of workforce and collections, and the two really go hand in hand, because as I sort of highlighted, without disabled, deaf and neurodivergent people working in museums and feeling safe to be able to say they are deaf, disabled or neurodivergent as well, you know, it's very difficult to actually start to tell those stories of the collections. Because without that lived experience, often items get lost or not catalogued correctly or not identified. And I can give an example of one of our fellows who's only been in post 6 weeks, has now identified 200 items that relate to disabled people's heritage within one museum collection. And the current staff hadn't been able to make those connections. So I really think the representation needs to be tackled through the workforce, and then that will ultimately have an impact on what's recognised in displays and collections, and therefore then have that further impact in terms of audience engagement as well.
And thanks, Esther. Over you, Tan, in terms of what do you think the critical issues are from your particular lens around diversity and inclusion?
First of all, I just wanted to describe myself as well. I forgot to do that in my introduction. I'm a Southeast Asian woman in my 30s, and I have long black hair, and I'm in a khaki dress or olive green. And in terms of, you know, the critical issues of today, I think in the context of working in inclusion is there is, and I'm going to bring in a pandemic in, and I know that will come up, but it is in the impact of ensuring that people's well-being and everything that's happened through, say, events, traumatic events like George Floyd murder, and the kind of like the loss of jobs in the sector, and the uncertainty, I guess, and cost of living, you know, financial security, career development, and then there's a critical issue around regress, possibly in diversity and inclusion, and losing people in the sector, losing the diversity of any that's been gained. So I think retention of staff, and also it being a core agenda that's, you know, even more important now than ever in our communities.
I think that's a really good reflection around that experience trauma, either unique or collective, as well as the impending issues around cost of living and the fact that it has an impact on workforce, but also on our audience's ability to participate and travel and see and join. So thank you very much. Over to you, Michelle. So critical issues for you affecting the sector from your particular lens.
Thank you. So just to kind of frame the particular lens of class that I'm talking about, I wanted to mention class as a very intersectional lens. We know that working class people are more likely to be from global majority, they're more likely to be living with disabilities, and they're more likely to be part of the LGBTQ+ community. So when we talk about class, we are talking about many different communities of people, which is also, you know, why we see it as such a pertinent issue of inclusion. And I have to say that Esther kind of picked the one issue for me that I wanted to talk about, and that is representation. You know, we do not have a representative workforce, and that therefore means that our audience demographics, our collections and our programming are not reflective of our communities. So for us in Museum as Muck, we, you know, one of our primary goals is to influence the amount of working class people in the sector, because we fundamentally believe that by having that representation in our museums, it therefore influences our outputs and the way that we connect with our audiences.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Yeah, really important point about that multiple belonging and multiple sense of identities that we have, rather than being pigeonholed. And I think that's sometimes where the legislation lets us down a little bit in terms of creating those groups where you're either here or there, and actually it's much bigger than that. So thanks for that reflection, Michelle. Freya, over to you. What do you think the critical issues are from your lens?
So I would say one of the big issues that I'd like to address is accessibility. So everybody should have equal access to museum collections. And I think this is where digital access really comes into its own, as it allows a global audience to become aware of collections and methods of acquisition, which can enable fundamental processes like repatriation. Museum interpretation, this is a huge issue, as all public-facing and internal collections interpretation should strive to be balanced and transparent. And then also my final one was representation, so which feeds into interpretation as well, ensuring that people are represented by collections in all museums. Their narratives are represented, they're represented in the workforce and also in public planning and engagement, which sort of touches on little bits of what everyone said as well.
Thank you. Sorry about that. And just just in terms of those issues, is there anything that's become more crystallized as a function of the pandemic? Is there anything that's been amplified from your perspective as being something that's even more important at this point in time? And I'm going to stay with you, Freya, for that.
Yeah, that's fine. So that's an interesting one. From a decolonial perspective, I would say that the pandemic itself, from a health point of view, hasn't actually had a huge effect on decolonization in museums. However, the period from 2020 through 2021 was full of events that had an unprecedented impact on the whole sector, which has spurred a lot of really active change. So like we've mentioned, the death of George Floyd in May 2020 and the ensuing Black Lives Matter protests, to the toppling of public statues in June 2020. These have all been catalysts for change across all levels of society, which sort of came in conjunction with the pandemic. And I'm not sure if that was because people had time to reflect, time to sort of educate themselves on these issues. But it's something that's come to the forefront and it absolutely needs to stay there.
Thank you. Esther, anything from your perspective that the pandemic's brought things into focus?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a double-edged sword, really, because obviously it's been hugely detrimental and a real tragedy for disabled people in some ways, as one of the biggest affected groups in terms of death rate. And also, I think the continuation now of many disabled people with health conditions really feeling like second-class citizens because they've been told to kind of just stay at home while the rest of the world gets back to normal. And that is a really massive issue for the disabled community. And I would hope that it stays in the forefront of cultural institutions' minds, that there is a real challenge now in terms of who can engage with culture safely and who is still going to find that a real risk factor. But the other side of it has been huge positive benefits in terms of digital engagement. And I would really encourage that we continue to at least have a hybrid approach. Firstly, that enables people that, like me, that are still shielding, to participate. You know, I wouldn't have been able to come to a conference today that was live, so I'm delighted that I can participate today in this one. But equally, you know, we've heard from our consultation work that before the pandemic, disabled people often have real issues in terms of travel, getting into buildings. So using digital as a means to really kind of facilitate access is something that we were already starting to think about and really needs to be kept again in the forefront of people's minds. And in terms of, you know, engaging with museums, a lot of disabled people may not have the energy to get somewhere, but they would really love to engage in terms of that sort of digital side of things. So again, I would really sort of encourage people to continue with their digital offer post-pandemic. And finally, sorry, I'm talking a lot, and one last thing is that also in terms of workforce, you know, offering people an option to do interviews online rather than having to be in person is something that we've noticed that over half of our applicants actually took up that offer. And I would still encourage that, you know, museums still think about offering different ways of being able to kind of participate in recruitment practices that might mean that you don't have to travel for 3 hours, be completely exhausted by the time you get to the interview, not do your best job, and then have to travel back again. So yeah, keep that hybrid working would be my my key takeaway, I suppose.
As you know, it's definitely a hill that I'm going to die on. Every time someone asks me to speak at a conference, I say, what platform is it going to be on? Because I'm not prepared to move back in time. This is such an important time for so many people. So yeah, absolutely. And Tanya, you already said, you know, the pandemic will come up at a point. So I don't know if you've got anything else that you'd like to share in terms of insights from a pandemic perspective. If not, it's fine, but just wondered if there was anything.
To really just add to Esther's point about hybrid working, I think that its potential for the workforce diversification as well as audience, you know, the participation is great. So I think that definitely not to rush to move into one way or another, and I think it's here to stay, really.
Thank you. And last but not least, Michelle, anything from a pandemic perspective, from your perspective?
Yes, plenty. So for working class people in museums, you know, the pandemic highlighted issues that were already there. These aren't new things that muckers are dealing with. So it highlighted issues, but it also worsened issues for our members. We did some consultation with our membership and found that 30% lost work or were made redundant, 43% experienced a drop in income, and 45% still had to travel to work because of the nature of the jobs that they traditionally do, be that kind of visitor services or security is where working class people tend to find themselves. Really importantly, we found that most of our members had issues around wellbeing and mental health due to the pandemic as well. But ultimately, what the pandemic has done is lost class diversity in the workforce, which, as you know, I mentioned at the beginning, is what we feel is needed to change. So the pandemic has been a setback in terms of that.
Thank you. Sorry, I think my connection was a little bit unstable, but I'm back. I'm back in the room. Thank you for that, Michelle. So next question, and what I know, having worked always at large national organisations, is often the conversations about change in the sector seem to always think about what would the BMs of this world do. But we know the BMs or the V&As or the Science Museum groups are almost outliers. The majority of museums in the sector are not huge monoliths that are nationally funded. Most museums are small, volunteer-led, local authority, civic. So in terms of those organisations, there might be people in the audience that are sitting in a small museum or working with a small museum. What do you think some of those issues might be in terms of affecting change? And I'm going to go to Tan first around this. So looking from an OD perspective, ultimately, perfect BBC Link. Now, what are those small organisations? What might be the challenges that they are facing more so?
Well, I think that the challenge is the funding, and the sources of income development for museums are getting squeezed more and more, and I think that a lot of organisations are looking at about survival. At this time where, how can they keep the building running, how they can keep their services running. And I think there's a risk then of looking at the kind of practicalities of being able to exist and lose the fact that who and what are you existing for and why do you exist. So those two things at the core has to run. The inclusion is not extras, it's actually even more relevance. It's about like the civic role that these museums play within their communities, within this post-pandemic, dare I say, recovery. This, it's going to be a long one if we are going to frame it as a recovery. And so when inclusion is at the core and underpins the ethos and principles of why why it exists in its locality and what its role is in those communities, I think that needs to stay as a core part of surviving, and even more of a way to sort of champion, why there must be more funding. So yeah, I think that the sort of survival mode can sort of kick in and not feel that we've already touched upon the loss of work of diversity and representation in the workforce, because people are not seeing a career or seeing able to be progressed.
Thanks, thank you. Michelle, over to you.
Yeah, so I think, challenges for smaller organisations are lack of resource in terms of funding and in terms of staffing. I think that a lot of them will be relying on volunteering, which in itself is a barrier for certain groups of people to get into museums. Some people aren't able to volunteer their time for free, and it really needs to be looked at as a route into the sector. It shouldn't be the only way. And also with a small staff team, you might be lacking a skill set in terms of expertise and inclusion. So yeah, lots of challenges, but I think that, within a smaller organisation, if we're trying to look at positives, you might be less intimidating to those community groups to want to access and take part in as an institution. Perhaps you can be more flexible in terms of bureaucracy, and maybe you're able to build more intimate relationships with your immediate communities around you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I was thinking about where an organisation might be based and thinking very clearly about nurturing those individual relationships that can grow more broadly if you're in a very small village, for example. Esther, anything from your perspective, any sort of understanding of the challenges, and feel free if you want to also just sort of move into some more hints and tips also around small museums specific.
Okay. Yes, I might touch on their hints and tips then as well, because, you know, I think Michelle and Diane have already covered quite a lot of the points I was going to make, mainly around resource. I think that's the biggest concern, is funding. And as you said, Tamsin, also location, how, you know, people can get to you, or how accessible you are. But I want to kind of talk a little bit more about potential opportunities to address some of those things, because I think, actually another challenge is confidence. I think the lack of confidence that people can sort of do this work and support people, and actually it's not a really daunting thing, and it is something that can actually really be valuable to your organization, rather than, oh, we have to do it because it's what we should be doing. Well, actually it will really bring value to your organization. So I think changing that mindset of thinking it's it's a tick box because we have to, actually it will bring real value. So in terms of confidence, I would suggest that people, you know, look at really good work that's going on and reach out to people that are doing this kind of work, because they'll probably be quite happy and able to sort of give advice and signpost people in directions of how they could go about trying to make some small changes. Not every change costs a lot of money. One thing that we've really noticed is a really simple thing is sending questions, interview questions, in advance of the interview helps people in so many ways, and it really ensures that the interviewee is able to give their kind of best rendition of themselves. And the 20 museums that we've been working with, of over half of them are all saying they're now already doing that because of just going through that process with us and seeing what a better interview that was by doing that process. That costs no money, sending interview questions in advance. So there are small things that people can do that really start to open up opportunities for people. So yeah, I just encourage people to look at good work that's going on and think about small changes that can be done.
I like that idea about what you said about individuals perhaps sort of saying, well, you know, we should do this. It's like somebody saying, I should go to the gym. You know, challenge that back when you hear that. This should be. Yeah, anything else in terms of hints and tips from anybody?
Yeah, I think I can jump in there. So because I've got that experience of working in small museums, one of the real positives actually I wanted to mention is it's actually a space where it is usually quicker and easier to implement actual change. We don't have to go through quite the same processes as these huge museums like Tamsin mentioned. I think that's really important to remember. And in terms of the capacity for museums to take on decolonial work, from my perspective, I think it's currently seen as an aside, an additional requirement to people's existing roles. But actually, decolonization should be viewed as something that needs to be integrated into the work that people already do and prioritized. And this works with things like training as well. And I'll come on to resources, I think, in a little bit. But help is out there, and it's just about coming to the fore. But organizations are offering training and workshops and courses to help small museums and staff members to actually start acting, to start creating change in their museum. And this comes from essentially making small changes. So start small, but don't be afraid to start, because it's always going to be a process. It's a learning process. Don't lose the momentum and keep going. So start small and don't be afraid to get it wrong. That's my big point of advice there, because doing something is always better than doing nothing.
Thank you. Any other hints and tips? Very wise words there, Freya, around how we sort of move this forward, certainly again for small museums. And I take that confidence point and those big museum examples. Tana, Michelle, anything else from a hints and tips perspective? And then we'll move on to resourcing and other areas of work, training, development. So we'll come back to that in a moment.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to say something about, even if you are working with a really small staff, broadening out who you're bringing into these conversations and this work. So, you're not as an individual responsible for this work, and actually how beneficial could it be if you are having discussions and consulting with everyone that's in your museum, the volunteers, the people who run the cafe, bring them into these conversations, start working groups. These people are more likely to have a range of lived experience, and they're going to be able to tell you, this is going to work better for me. This, if you make this small change, that's going to help bring, my friends and family in. They're going to feel like this is a place for them. So, it's about lived experience from all kind of parts of your museum, not just holding the work in, in one place and with one person, with one department.
Yeah, very clearly following their lead, not our ideas. Yep, great. Tarn, anything else from you? Hints and tips?
Well, I would say that, in terms of sharing knowledge and building confidence, picking it up on Esther's point about confidence, it's connecting into networks, like small museums. You might be small or feel like isolated, but if you connect up, there's a whole network of supports and services, and also in terms of sector development, support organisations such as the Museum Association and Ames Museum and other organisations and other networks that can support. Naming two already, Museum Detox and Museums as Muckers. So I think that there's learning and development that can be shared. There's support and solidarity that can be connect. You can connect to as well, and to try things out. To Freya's point, take those steps and try them out, and engage with various voices.
Thank you for that. So that connection making and networking and listening to others as we're doing today, can really bolster that confidence and enable you to feel able to take that next step. So there are lots of different movers and shakers and good practice and training providers all around in museum space in general, but this space specifically as an emerging area. So are there any sort of particular resources, either from your own work or own organisations, that you'd like to signpost, and we can share those later? Or is there anything that's a go-to for you when you're having conversations with people about those next steps over and above perhaps joining a network? So I'm going to come to Esther specifically. So let me reiterate, where should people look around current thinking? And are there any key groups, individuals, networks that people should be engaging with over and above the ones we've already highlighted? So thank you, guys.
Well, specifically in terms of disabled kind of engagement, I would certainly look at Vocalise. I think they're doing a lot of great work. They've done various sort of heritage surveys that really give people a sense of the barriers that people face when they're looking to kind of visit museum and heritage sites. And they're also very much interested in workforce and doing just lots of good practice generally around engagement. Dash Arts are another disabled-led organisation that have done specifically curatorial work. So I'd look at their programme that they've been, again, working in partnership with museums, more in kind of an arts context, less of a sort of heritage one. And I'm going to also just pop a link to what we're doing in the chat, if that's all right.
Absolutely. Yeah, feel free. I'm just getting Dash Arts up. I'm going to pop that into the chat as well as Vocalise as well. And another one that I would recommend, which is a fairly new kid on the block, is it's not working, is the Neurodiverse Museum. So the Neurodiverse Museum is a new organisation that's looking at representation, it's looking at workforce, and it's looking also from an audience lens around how different museums can think about appealing broadly, you know, so over and above the sort of the quiet or early openings, which is fantastic, but actually there's lots of other things that people can do. But I'll try and put those links in, they're not working for me at the moment. So thank you, Esther. So Vocalise, Dash Arts, obviously your good work, and the Neurodiverse Museum. I'm now going to come to Tan. So we've already talked about museum detox, but anywhere else that we should be looking for inspirational practice and support?
Yeah. Oh, I silenced my. No, sorry, I haven't. Yeah, I'm just thinking of looking at some of work around ink arts, which is it's in the cultural and arts sector generally. It started in arts and sort of theatre culture, but generally they have a lot of tools and resources to support with inclusion, representation, equity, and coming from racial practice around workshops and tools like Unlock. So there's a lot of resources there available, as well as consultancy and training and development. I would say that look for the specialists in the sector that do equity, diversity and inclusion work, and there's another organisation called Disability Collaborative Network. And so I'll put those links in, and they provide consultancy advice, and also there's lots of resources on the website as well that you can use.
Thank you very much. Michelle, anyone other than your dear selves at Museum as Mark, but anywhere else we should be looking, or any people we should be following in terms of sort of intersectional and class work within the sector? Good projects, whatever.
It's a really hard one, because I have to say Museum as Mark. I mean, we're the leader in the sector when it comes to this work. And often, people ask me, can you name some organisations that are doing exemplary work? And we're struggling to name those museums. If people want to get in touch and tell us about that, great, because then we can share your projects. Museum as Mark website has a whole page of resources, books, links, articles, videos, and we also offer training sessions to make people more aware of the issue, to get them comfortable in talking about the issue and making this a priority. So yeah, in terms of class, Museum as Mark.
Thank you very much. I'm just about to put the website into the chat function, hence my look of scariness at that point. Freya, over to you.
So yeah, I just wanted to mention, I'll do a little bit of a MA promotion here. They're just taking applications for the Decolonization Confidence and Skills Programme. I think that's being launched ahead of the Museum Essentials training, which is coming out later this year, I believe. But that's going to be such a good resource for the museum sector to really take on board, as they've already released ones around ethics and collections and things like that, which have been excellent. Very recently, Empire, Slavery and Scotland's museums have just released a set of government, the government commissioned a set of 6 recommendations, which they very recently released. And although that is taking a Scottish perspective, they are really, really very good, sort of workable recommendations that museums of all sizes can take on board. It's an excellent document. It's not too long. It's not too mind-boggling. It's very, very, very useful for museums. So I can't recommend that highly enough. And the last one I would point you to is the Collections Trust. They've got some really excellent resources available online, all about decolonizing the database, which is a slightly different angle, but equally as important. So yeah, they would be my main go-tos.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Now we're really Going forward now to answering questions from the rest of the audience, I've got 2 questions. So one of the first questions that I've just posted, and this is from Jake Clark, so thank you so much, Jake, is: should reconstructions and illustrations depicting the past be more reflective of modern audiences? And Jake's put a reflection in as well. I feel that making sure that we have representation in these resources could give more people a sense of belonging to heritage. So yeah, any thoughts on that? Whomever wants to answer. Any thoughts?
I can jump in. I mean, I'm not a curatorial expert, but I feel that, and obviously this is open to the panel to add to or disagree with, perhaps in a lot of circumstances, the history is actually more representative than what we think of. So can we actively seek out those stories of inclusion to represent whatever story you're looking at? So for example, a Tudor depiction, find the Black Tudors, find those stories, highlight those. Yeah, so I wonder if perhaps, the stories are there, we need to be better at presenting them.
Yeah, it's similar to Esther's point about the trainees and the fellows going into a museum and finding 200 objects that would have related to lived experience around disability, and those stories are there. It's just that we're not prioritising to look at them. So yeah, that's a really good reflection. Does anyone else from the panel want to talk about the reinterpretation, the updating of materials, stories or representation, and what they think that means? Esther.
Yeah, just to kind of jump in on the back of the end of that, completely agree with Michelle and you in terms of the material is there. It's just about, finding it, but then the next step, of course, is interpreting that material. And I think that, again, is why it's so important to have somebody with a lived experience doing that interpretation, because they will understand the nuances of language. They will understand the kind of other sort of ableist and oppressive ideas that go alongside things to be able to tackle that in the way that the material's interpreted. And picking up on the comment about, is it better to kind of have that kind of modern reflection and not worry too much about inaccuracies as well? I'd agree. Yes, let's get the stories out there. But I think if you involve people with lived experience, then they will be able to do that interpretation. And then you can have that kind of dialogue between past and present. We did, when we worked with V&A, we did a kind of audio description, and all the museums we worked with actually. And one of them, particularly in Bristol, because the site we were looking at was called the Guild of the Brave Poor Things, which clearly has some quite challenging connotations around that language. So we had a kind of audio description that was actually kind of a dialogue between present thinking and that language, and why that was a challenge. So I think have that discussion and bring the two together.
Brilliant. Thanks, Esther. Any other sort of reflections on that question? Don't worry, you don't have to have an answer for every single question. Is there anything you'd like to say? So Tan and then Freya.
Yeah, I just, my reflection on that is that I feel, with history, it's the history we choose to remember, and it's what's it's what's kind of made visible. So with the things around accuracies, there are stories to be uncovered, there are stories that are there, and there's also stories to be uncovered, but there's also bringing in whatever the topic or subject matter is discussed about, what is its relevance to today, and where are we trying to go with this? And I think that brings what opens up a wider conversation and an opportunity for wider people to participate. And yeah, so I kind of feel if we get too stuck on, well, we don't have anything that would speak to that, so therefore we can never speak to that, means that there's nothing that we can build on. And I think that we have to kind of be opening that up, really.
Yeah, some really good reflections. Thank you. And Freya. And then we've got one more question before we begin to start closing.
Yeah, I just wanted to have a really quick little shout about a project at the London Metropolitan Archives, which I volunteered on last year, but I know it's still going. It's called Switching the Lens, and it's bringing together huge, vast quantities of volunteers to go through thousands of archives and actually find the stories, find references to Black and ethnic minority and people of colour in the archives, and then researching these people and their stories and bringing them to life, because those stories are there. And the way that we often choose to view history is extremely whitewashed, and it's in fact not the case. Obviously, this is London-centred, but it's a really interesting project, and I think it just speaks to Jake's question.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Next question from the audience, which gets back to the point that we've made around volunteering. So the question is from, I think, Nicola, who wants to know, how do we make volunteering more inclusive and less privileged? Does anyone want to start that conversation?
I can start. Allocate resource to it. You've got to allocate some funding. In order to have a diverse volunteering workforce, you've got to have access funds. You've got to enable people to get there. You've got to work around people with caring disabilities. You need to ask people what support they need and able to work with you. I think if you've got challenges around funding and resource, perhaps there are external charities, volunteering charities that work with underrepresented groups, and they're not necessarily museum related, but they're working with, young people from working class backgrounds in the local area and they want to look at developing work skills. They might not have thought about, those young people might not necessarily want to get into museums, but partner with that charity, they can provide the support, the structure, that maybe you can't provide in terms of supporting those volunteers, but you can still be a resource and be of use. And therefore, those people are going to contribute something to your museum, and perhaps they will become interested in working with museums.
Yeah, I think there's sort of sometimes organisations think people should be sort of genuinely grateful, and they're lucky to be working with us from a volunteering perspective. And we need to be moving away from that. This is the only way and means you can volunteer with us, to say, how would you like to volunteer with us? Just as we're doing with audiences. Yes, a really good reflections around access, budgets and support. Anybody else got some handy hints or insights or recommendations of organisations that are doing it well around inclusive volunteering? Anybody else from the panel?
I wanted to talk a bit about, this hybrid approach and the digital access in enabling better access overall for our audiences as well as workforce, and also for volunteering. There's micro volunteering on very specific things, and what does that add to? What's the benefits for somebody volunteering? And it could be because it's fulfilling a passion for them. It could be that it's particular skills that they're looking to develop. It could be that it's a reference they would like to have, or a connection they'd like to make. So actually looking at, what's the value we can give here in exchange of your volunteering, and actually, can we not make it such a big kind of cumbersome thing to volunteer? Can it be micro volunteering and be set up in that way? And I know there is, I can't think of one particular to mind, but I know that there are micro volunteering in practice.
Yeah, I think that it's changing, and that micro and digital volunteering or event volunteering, and gone are the days where you have to work every Wednesday between 9 and 5 as a volunteer in lots of organisations. But yeah, it's moving in the right direction. Any other hints and tips before I sort of come back to all of you for your final nuggets? Anything about inclusive volunteering? Okay, so for those of you that are, I've put a little link in the chat functions. Heritage Volunteer Group is a network for people that manage, support, coordinate volunteering, and their focus very much is on inclusivity and have an EDI working group and action learning set. So have a look there as well if you're wanting to get more information about how you can shift volunteering to becoming more inclusive. So in the last 5 minutes of our session, really just want to go to everybody that's around the panel, just if there's either a real word of wisdom, a call to arms, as it were, or anything else that you feel, do you know what, actually, I really want the audience here to hear this and hear this now. And I'm going to go to Esther first.
I think I'll just pick up on something I said earlier, really, that don't think of inclusion and equity as a sort of tick box thing that you have to do, but think of it as an opportunity for your organisation, because it will ensure that you get a lot more diverse ideas, lived experiences, creative thinking, and that will be of real value to your organisation. And I think it will also ensure that you stay relevant and that you can engage with audiences that otherwise you might not have reached before. So think of it as an opportunity, not as something that's, you know, a bit of a chore.
Thank you. Michelle, a little word of wisdom from you, and then I'll come to Freya and then finally Tom.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, absolutely, it's about opportunity, and it's about making our museums better. You know, if we're engaging with this work, we are becoming more representative and inclusive of our communities and serving as many people as possible, and that's what we're here for. That's what museums have a civic duty to do. Class is a difficult subject and people get uncomfortable talking about it, but we're here as Museum as Muck to say, let's get this conversation started. We're here to help give you the tools, the language, the support to do that. And if you are from a working class background, join the network. You know, to reference what Tam was saying earlier about networks being places of belonging and community and joy. That's also a really important thing when we're doing inclusion work as well.
Thank you. So Freya.
Yeah, the point that I really wanted to, that I think I didn't really push across as strongly as I wanted to, and I wanted to just kind of circle back to, was that part of decolonization work is about breaking down gatekeeping, that kind of idea that it's the curators and the museum staff who have the access to the knowledge and the collections. And decolonization practice, I think, can lose its meaning if it's only fed into by museum staff and professionals, because this perspective risks being too narrow and potentially lacking in lived experience. And so I just wanted to really emphasize how important community input is and co-production as something that we can all implement to make sure that everybody is represented and heard in museums.
Thank you very much. And finally, Tan.
I really want to say in terms of well-being, actually, and looking after yourself doing this work. So this is a call to the willing, the people that are working for change, working for better equity in the sector and inclusion in the sector, that your work matters. It's really important. You've got more allies and more friends and supporters than you think at times, and that, you know, that all those networks of support are a way for you to resource yourself, and also to feel that, you know, there's people, there's work that you're building on from before, and there's people with you and behind you and in front of you. So it's okay to also kind of, you know, be looking after yourself, and to continue the great work, to think about the impact that you're making.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So thank you to all of our panelists for their excellent reflections, perfect summing up around all of the areas we've talked about today. Thank you to everybody in the audience, either live for asking questions or those of you that are going to be catching up on Catch Up. This is an area of work that is important. We need to be moving forward. However, small steps, we get there in the end. So once again, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of XpoNorth, and yeah, have a great Thursday, everybody. Thank you.